Good evening. This is the second part and the last one of the historical sketches dedicated to the Schism of 1054 AD between the Western and the Eastern Christian churches. In the first part, we attempted to point out or demonstrate the following. The very intricate theological disputes which nominally lay at the core of the controversies. We also touch on the background causes of the controversies that eventually led to a complete severance between the two churches, namely that Byzantium and the Orthodox churches lived, prospered, and were the natural intellectual heirs of the Greek culture and mode of thought, out of which they actually sprang. Whereas the Western Christian Church had a more legalistic and actually, if you like, imperialistic mentality. In the Christianity before the Schism, the Pope was nominally and effectively just one of the 5 patriarchs that Christianity divided itself into. He was given special recognition, for he was the Patriarch of Rome, but nominally at least he was like the other patriarchs. And also, briefly mentioned, the Schism brewed and matured over a long period, about 700 years. And historians have agreed to make 1054 AD as the official date of the breakup between the East and West. However, attempts of reconciliation were ongoing and continued even afterwards. But all hopes of reconciliation were dashed during the Crusades, and especially after the last Crusades, as we will see later. In this episode, we will talk about some of the most important episodes of the dispute leading to the schism itself. Now, the already complicated tangle of theological differences that we saw before was made even more complicated by several other factors. For one, in Constantinople, as mentioned in the last episode, the emperor actually had a dual relationship with respect to the church, and in the instance with the Patriarch of Constantinople, of course. He was the sun and the Patriarch was the moon when it came to politics. But the relation was somewhat reversed when it came to religion. So it came about that at times, whereas the religious or theological disputes would pit Byzantium against the Pope, political and strategic considerations made an alliance between the Emperor and the Pope advisable. After the capital of the Roman Empire was moved from Rome to the east in the 3rd century, most of Italy gradually descended into a state of chaos due to various waves of barbaric invasions. The infrastructures, as we would say today, collapsed, and the only organization left that could provide or guarantee a minimum of administration and order was the Church, which then the Church acquired within itself the civil, military and religious authority required to run what was, in essence, a new state information, the state of the Church. To substantiate the claim of the Western Patriarch, whom from now on we will call the Pope, it was claimed that the first Constantine, the founder of Constantinople, the founder of New Rome, had made a donation of part of Italy to the Pope for him to rule over. This came to be known as the false donation of Constantine, for it was indeed a fabrication. Still, the Pope, besides ruling over its own state, also arrogated to himself the spiritual dominance over all the rulers in the world in the image, as we saw before, of the sun and the moon. By the way, this is not much different from the current nefarious, if I may, American foreign policy, except that rather than advocating the right to rule the world because of the will of God, it advocates the right for being the exceptional nation. The claim of the Pope to be both a civil and religious ruler was the third complicating factor, as the claim was incompatible with the type of administration that was set up in Byzantium, in Constantinople. Those observations or conditions have to be kept in mind to put into context whatever happened afterwards. In this, as I said, very complicated tangle. One important and almost semi-theological item of contention and mention in the first episode had to do, I did not mention in the first episode, it had to do with the images. We all know the magnificent art developed in the creation of the images or icons, especially in the Eastern Church. That are almost synonymous, Eastern Church and icons. When we think of the Orthodox Church, we think of those beautiful images, Byzantine images. Today, when we think of icons, we think of the tiny graphic symbols on a computer screen. And during the first century of the Eastern Roman Empire, icons developed in what we today would call a cult, with all the characteristics of a pagan ritual. This cult originated, developed, and promoted in monasteries, was promoted there, and in particular in the monastery of Studion, near Constantinople, and of which we see an image here. The residents of the monastery were referred to as the Studites, and incidentally, the laws and costume of the Studion were taken as models for the monks of Mount Athos and of many other monasteries of the Orthodox world. And even today they have an influence. Eventually, both the patriarchs of Constantinople and the emperors felt that the cult of the icons was becoming another form of paganism, in that believing that an icon is sacred is not much different from paganism. And having the authority of deciding on the sacrality of the images was a source both of economic power and of potential disruption. The danger of paganism, incidentally, is also the reason why the Muslim religion forbids the representation of Muhammad and of images in general. However, because the artistic impulse cannot be eradicated in man, the Islamic art has evolved into a magnificent architecture, decorative painting, and calligraphy, of which we still find examples in the Arabic world, those Arabic world that has been spared from the efforts of bringing to it freedom and democracy. Now, we should forget that the same issues of iconoclasm, as it was called, was one of the key points of the Lutheran protest, along with the selling of indulgences. In fact, any one of you who is not Lutheran and walks into a Lutheran church will be struck by the total absence of images. And this first iconoclastic period lasted from 730 AD to 787 AD. In the instance, the monks in Byzantium appealed to the Pope. The Pope denounced iconoclasm as an error, but did not take much initiative against it. He was, however, upset when Byzantium transferred the religious administration of Sicily and of the region referred to as Illyricum to the Eastern Church. And this was part of a reorganization of the Eastern Empire. The emperor had no longer control over Italy except Ravenna and the Exarchate, as we saw in the previous episodes. It was logical in this process of reorganization to make the territory of the Patriarchate of Constantinople coextensive with the territory governed by the lay authority of the empire. We should note that even overlooking theological interpretations, the two main patriarchates, Byzantium and Rome, had developed essentially different structures. And this was inevitable, considering that the language of the Eastern churches was Greek and the language of the Western Church was Latin, and continued to remain Latin until well into the 20th century, with one important difference: that whereas in the East the brethren understood the church prayers, the brethren in the West, notably Italy, did not, for the Latin language was no longer spoken, and it had evolved or morphed, as we would say today, in a large variety of local dialects, out of which there arose slowly and eventually national languages such as Spanish, French, and Italian. France, in this matter, actually acted independently, for in 813 AD, at the Council of Tours, the French bishops decided to adopt a local language in the Mass and the rituals. Still, notwithstanding this transfer of religious jurisdiction, the Pope did not cut his ties completely with Constantinople. In fact, he was threatened. He was threatened by the Lombards and appealed to Constantinople for military assistance. Byzantium could not help, so he turned to the Franks, and that is the beginning of the policy that led to the coronation of Charlemagne as the first emperor of the Roman Western Empire. Now, with the advent of this Frankish German dominance and theology over the West, there were two movements for reform. One for the churches and the other for the monasteries, the monastery reform coming out of the famous Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy in France. They put themselves under direct control of the Pope to prevail over those contrary to the reform. And this meant that the Pope should override all over ecclesiastical authorities. And here we find the controversy about adding the sentence "and the Son" to the definition of the Holy Ghost as opposed "through the Son." No intention here to redescribe the controversies, except to note that St. Anselm, who lived in the 13th century, who lived actually in the 11th century, decided that the best way to explain the Holy Trinity was that the Latins talk of one substance and three persons, whereas the Greeks talked of one person and three substances. But, as I said earlier on, the original creed had been issued by an ecumenical council, which for the East was the only instrument of doctrinal authority. For the Western Church, on the other hand, to tamper arbitrarily with the creed of the council was tantamount to heresy, as well as being an attack on the whole theory of church government and doctrine. Now, if we choose to date the final schism between the East and West from the last mention of a Roman Pope in the directory of patriarchs kept at Constantinople, the last Pope recorded was John XVIII, who died in 809 AD. The directory was called a diptych, and looked like what you see in the picture. Even so, in the 11th century, there was no feeling that the unity of Christendom had been broken. After all, for a long time, the patriarchs of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria had operated in lands now run by the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt. Furthermore, Byzantium recaptured Antioch in Syria in 969 AD, and the caliphs of Jerusalem were tolerant and friendly towards the Christians, and well aware of the financial returns brought by the Christian merchants and pilgrims to the holy sites. At the beginning of the 11th century, Byzantium controlled most of the south of Italy, but for two dukedoms still held by the Lombards and three self-governing merchant cities, Gaeta, Naples, and Amalfi, who were in very good terms with Byzantium. But in 1020, a Lombard by the name of Milo organized an Orange Revolution against Byzantium using some troops of Normans who had come in pilgrimage to the holy shrine of St. Michael nearby. And these are the same Normans that colonized Normandy earlier on, that occupied England and later occupied most of south of Italy. The Pope, Leo IX, at first was happy about the revolt against Byzantium, but then he saw the Normans were approaching Rome and he asked for the help of the Byzantines this time. The Emperor Constantine IX appointed a Lombard by the name of Argyrus to the command of the imperial troops in Italy. Argyrus, being Latin, was sympathetic to the cause of Rome. But now the Patriarch of Constantinople came onto the scene by the name of Michael Cerularius. He was a retired civil servant who had taken orders late in life, and he was not versed in theology, and by all accounts he was quite arrogant. He was deeply suspicious of Argyrus, the general of the troops in Italy, And besides, Cerularius was anxious to bring uniformity to the practices of the Greek Church, and he also attempted to integrate the Armenian Church into the Church of the Empire. But some of the rituals of the Armenians, which have to be brought into the picture, were the same as those of the Latins. They used, for example, unleavened bread for the sacrament. They approved fasting on Saturdays and such other misdemeanors. But how could Cerularius impose on the Armenians what he tolerated in the Latin churches in Constantinople? He told the Latin churches in Constantinople to adopt Greek usages. The Latins refused, and he closed them down. After which, Cerularius sent a letter to the Pope denouncing the use of unleavened bread, fasting on Saturdays, eating strangled meat, and not singing Alleluia in the days just prior to Lent. Just imagine. In the meantime, in Italy, the Normans defeated the forces of Byzantium led by Argyrus and had exiled the Pope to an honorable captivity in the city of Benevento. The letter of Cerularius was written in Greek, and it is possible that the translation in Latin was poor, but the Pope was outraged. He replied to the letter explaining the supremacy of the Roman See based on the famous donation of Constantine, which was, as I said before, a fake. In the meantime, Cerularius, perhaps at the solicitation of the emperor, wrote another letter, much more amicable. However, he addressed the Pope as brother instead of father, the title with which the patriarchs recognized the Pope's seniority. Now the Pope, Leo IX, decided to send some legates to Constantinople to discuss the issue involved, and they were led by Cardinal Humbert. And now things went downhill in a rush. On arriving to Constantinople, the legates went first to see Cerularius, the Patriarch, but were dissatisfied with the protocol, so they left the letter without the ritual salutations. Cerularius opened the letters and was astounded at the content. He then, in turn, refused to recognize the authority of the legates, which turned out to be a good thing to do because, in the meantime, the Pope that sent them, Leo IX, died. But the legates were well received by the emperor, and we showed earlier on that the emperor and the patriarch in Constantinople were two reasonably independent entities in religious matters. The letters that had that made Cerularius mad were replied to by a monk in the Studium monastery that we saw before, and who, more than a reply, he wrote a treatise criticizing again the practices over unleavened bread, the ban on married priests, and adding, for the record, the practice of celebrating an ordinary and not a pre-sanctified Mass during Lent. The legates counterattacked on certain Greek practices such as mixing warm water with the communion wine. Can you imagine? The emperor wanted to be conciliatory and forced the monk of Studium to retract his treatise. At this point, the legates brought up again the business of the sun, and while Cerularius decided that it was best to keep quiet. Eventually, on the 16th of July, 1054, the legates stormed into the church of Santa Sophia and laid on the altar a bull excommunicating Cerularius and all his followers. The bull was filled with other accusations. Cerularius was accused of simony, which was actually a prevalent practice in Rome anyway. It accused the Eastern Church of encouraged castration, a practice also followed in Rome, of allowing priests to marry, of baptizing women in labor, of refusing communion to men who had shaved their beards, and other such crimes. The emperor was dumbfounded, and first he thought that the bull had been doctored in its translation. He then sent messengers to the legates asking them to come back and show him the original Latin version, but they refused. In the meantime, Cerularius' his friends, had published the contents of the bull in Constantinople, with the express purpose of raising the anger of the populace. The Latin legates were in turn excommunicated by Cerularius in absentia. The emperor yielded and ordered the bull to be burned, and it took 100 years from the day of July 1054 to be interpreted as the official date of the schism. And why? For one thing, at Constantinople the situation soon calmed down. But in the West, the sudden attack on Latin usages made more publicity than all other previous disputes. The excommunication of Cerularius was considered the payback for an unprovoked attack on Rome. And since neither Cerularius nor his followers repented or asked for absolution, they were henceforth declared to be in a state of schism. And the Orthodox Church has been in a state of schism ever since. And it is thanks to these Western attacks on Cerularius that he became an Orthodox national hero. Still, up to the end of the 11th century, most circles in Rome and Byzantium did not feel the impact of the schism, or they had forgotten that it actually occurred. We must remember that the schism related to religious aspects of the relationship between the East and the West, and not to the political status between the two potentates. As I said before, the Crusade sealed the separation of the two churches. And here we should say something about the general different view of what is considered the enemy between the East and the West culture, if you like. I noted earlier on that when the Arabs conquered Jerusalem, they were more than happy to allow the Christians to continue with their own practices. After all, Christians brought in tourism, trade, and profit. And besides, Byzantium had a different problem with the Turks, who were not Arabs, and first there were the Seljuk Turks, and then eventually the Ottomans, who conquered Byzantium in 1453. In other words, Byzantium did not consider the presence of the Arabs what we would call today a conflict of civilizations. The eventual fall of Byzantium in 1453 was caused by a continued weakening of the empire for reasons that are outside the scope of this historical sketch. The First Crusade was launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, and it was the intent of all crusades not to find any room for compromise between the Crusaders and the Arabs, which brings us to another important cultural difference between East and West that extends well beyond this episode of the schism. The East talks to its enemies as well as fighting them. Palestine and the Holy Land went through stages when they were part of the Byzantine Empire or of an Arab caliphate, but the relations between the two entities, Byzantium and the Arabs, continued. The West accepted nothing else but war or surrender. And there is an interesting episode. One of the most famous emperors of the German-Roman Empire was Frederick II of Swabia. His father was German and his mother Sicilian, an unusual combination in itself. He grew up in Sicily, he was clever, he knew Arabic, as at the time Sicily was a crucible of peoples and civilizations. And the Pope, Innocent III, requested of Frederick that he launch a crusade to reconquer Jerusalem, which he did. But on arrival, the Caliph asked to speak with him. And on hearing in Arabic that Frederick wanted Jerusalem, he yielded it to him as a sign of friendship. So there was no war. But for the Pope, a crusade without war made no sense. Therefore, he excommunicated the emperor. What had not been anticipated in organizing the crusade was that a vast army of crossing from Europe all the way to Palestine needed supplies, and these were acquired by pillaging and by actual battles between the inhabitants of Byzantium and the Crusaders, and this of course left a very bitter taste among the Orthodox Christians. But the apex of this crisis came with the Fourth Crusade, when the Crusaders decided to hire ships from the Venetians, from Venice. But they couldn't pay the whole bill, so they first reconquered the Christian city for Venice on the Adriatic coast by the name of Zara, and then a renegade Byzantine prince of the imperial family made a deal with the Crusaders and the Venetians, almost equivalent to one of today's Orange Revolutions, The deal meant that rather than going to Jerusalem, the Crusaders would go and attack Byzantium. They would install the renegade Byzantine on the throne by the name of Alexius. In exchange, the emperor would let the Crusaders and the Venetians loot the Byzantine treasure, and so they did, after which the renegade Alexius was quickly gotten rid of and strangled. There were battles between the emperor's forces and the Crusaders and the Venetian besiegers. The Venetians won and told the soldiers that they could spend the next 3 days in complete pillage. And this sack of Constantinople by the Christians is a very ghastly episode. Apart from the victims and all sorts of horrors, libraries were burned and scores of manuscripts of the ancient world and countless works of art were lost and destroyed. Much as it happened when the Americans brought freedom and democracy to Iraq. As you know, the magnificent Iraq Museum was sacked. And this Fourth Crusade was never forgotten or forgiven by the Christians in the East. And the sack of Constantinople, after it, the invaders imposed allegiance to Rome. The existing bishops were deposed and substituted with Latin bishops, most of whom did not know Greek, so you can imagine the confusion. This Latin version of the Byzantine Empire lasted for about 60 years. Eventually, the original Byzantine Empire was re-established, but when, 200 years later, the West failed to rescue Byzantium in her battle against the Turks, the last possible chance for reconciliation went away. Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, but the division between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity continued to this day. We can hear echoes of the division even today in the recent events in Ukraine and in the posture of the political West towards Russia and Moscow. For Moscow is the new Rome that was called the New Rome in time. It became in time the center of Orthodox Christianity. I am conscious of having only touched on the main points of this really tragic sequence of events, but extending to history what Dr. Johnson said of dictionaries, no history is complete, but any is better than none. So, thank you for watching. Thank the crew again and Kat Iverson, our director, and I am Jimmy Mollia. See you next time. Good night. A73 AD